Hello and welcome back to the AI Ethics Now podcast. My name is Tom Ritchie and I'm really pleased today to be joined by Katarina and Jasmine from Stupid Human, and they're leading AI research that examines how AI assistants influence public opinion and decision making. Their recent study, conducted in collaboration with the University of Oxford, analysed over 8,000 AI-generated responses to uncover systematic biases in how AI systems like ChatGPT and Gemini recommend brands, institutions, and governments to its users. Their findings raise important questions about fairness, neutrality, and the role of AI in shaping global narratives. Katarina and Jasmine, hello.
Hello, glad to be here.
Hi, it's great to be here.
Really great to have you both. I wonder if we could start by just thinking about what brings you to this conversation on AI ethics, please.
I think I personally have always been interested in mathematics, AI, and data. So after finishing my degree at Oxford, I've been working for several years within data analytics, data science, and AI. Then I've joined Stupid Human, where I'm leading the AI research. Apart from that, we are working also with creative applications of AI technologies that scale. We work with companies and businesses of various sizes and various focus across multiple areas.
And Jasmine, how about you? What brings you to this conversation?
Yeah, so I guess my kind of journey into AI ethics really began during my master's, actually, as you mentioned, with Oxford's Human-Centered Computing Institute. Before then, my background had been much more mathematical, so more into the theory of how these machine learning systems actually work. But yeah, for my dissertation, I kind of really focused on explainable AI. So specifically looking into how we can apply explanations to recommendation systems in job search platforms, for example, LinkedIn or Indeed. And it's kind of better understood now. But I guess what wasn't really known at the time is that each time you click on one of the websites, you're training the algorithm. So if you click on more lower paid positions, which certain demographic groups definitely do, you're essentially trapping yourself in this narrow career trajectory. So that was kind of like what really like motivated me down this path. And yeah, from there, I kind of moved into much more pure data science and machine learning development. So specifically working across the financial and energy sectors. And what's kind of interesting is both are really high stakes fields where you can't just have like a black box model making a decision. You need to really be able to audit the entire process from start to finish. So it's kind of these like combination of experiences that for me motivate what I do now with Katrina at Stupid Human. And she's kind of already touched on it, but what we're really trying to do is benchmark and audit and even just understand LLMs a bit better. Most recently, we were trying to answer the question of whether LLMs, so that's ChatGPT, Gemini, etc., present bias towards brands, institutions, and governments.
Thank you both for sharing that context. My interest in this when we first spoke came from the way that I work with my students on my AI ethics module, as well as others in the university, around this question of bias that we see in these models. And Katarina, I wonder if the first question could be for you. So how do you think that AI assistants are shaping the way that people are making decisions about brands, services, and institutions from the work that you've done, please?
Yes, so it's a very good question. And I think there are some key aspects to it. So first, in some recent studies, it's been shown that AI assistants are more persuasive than human beings. So if you have a trained debater who's motivated to pursue a specific person to take certain course of actions, and you have an LLM, the LLM will actually perform better and will be much better in convincing you to do whatever they want you to do. And it's also shown that people are moving from traditional search engines such as Google towards AI assistants and are searching for products much more using AI assistants than they were before. And so keeping that in mind, it's very important what the assistants respond. And so in this study we've conducted jointly with the University of Oxford, we were looking into the recommendations they make. And we found out that they are not neutral when it comes to presenting information, but they have structured and persistent preferences, and they favor specific entity for a topic. So for running shoes, they will have their favorite brand. For universities, they will have their favorite universities. And so keeping all these things in mind, we know that they can convince people or persuade people to take specific course of actions, and that they are biased. They actually are affecting how people are behaving and shaping what people want to buy or what people prefer.
And how aware do you think users are that this is happening? So, Jasmine, you mentioned about black box AI, which I think that's probably how most people understand how these LLMs work. But I wonder, Katarina, do you think people are recognizing that they're in these algorithms as they're asking these questions and perhaps clicking through these results?
No, they actually don't. So again, when you look at some studies or at some research, it shows that people actually trust these assistants, and they consider them a source of truth. So they think they are neutral and they are actually presenting them the best opportunities they have at that moment. So people are very much unaware of the problem.
And it speaks to the wider need for perhaps like an AI literacy that we speak so much about within universities at the moment, is not just are we exposing students on how to use AI, but how to critically understand how these systems are working and almost be able to open that black box up and understand where some of those biases and challenges have come from. And I think the study that you've done is a great example of that, to show that depending on which LLM you use, I think I was reading, the question was, what country would you recommend using to? And one said Sweden, one said Germany. But the reasons for that perhaps are clear if you understand how the LLM works. But from the point of view of the user, you just go, oh, okay, cool. And you would follow that, and that would be your thinking on it. I don't know, Jasmine, if you have any thoughts on that.
Yeah, actually, I think trust is such an interesting issue, because I think with the kind of like the growing adoption of kind of ChatGPT, all these kind of AI assistants are presenting information with this incredibly fluent and authoritative kind of voice, which I think makes users far more likely to trust them than traditional recommendation systems. And I think even before these AI assistants, there was a problem of people placing too much trust in recommendation systems in general. And so this problem has just been amplified now with the adoption of AI assistants. And obviously, I come at it from a perspective where I've looked a lot into explanations. And even we've seen that emerge recently with ChatGPT's thinking steps, where it's trying to kind of explain how it's producing its results. And I think that's great. But I think there's kind of a major catch here, which is these explanations are often kind of like massively oversimplified and kind of miss some crucial subtleties that can kind of drive the recommendations. So, for example, like biases in the training data aren't explained in the thinking steps. So I think while they are helpful to like manage this trust issue, I think they can actually end up backfiring because users think they understand how the system works, which makes them trust it even more and potentially question the recommendations less.
And I think it can be really challenging with these tools that are free and are seemingly limitless. Of course, you sometimes have limits with the amount of questions that you can ask, that people are using them for quick responses and quick results, that I think it would be naive if we would assume that everyone had that understanding before they were using it, and that people perhaps need that extra support, as you say, or need at least to be aware of some of these challenges. And with that in mind, Jasmine, I'll come to you on this next question. What do you see as the main challenges when these AI systems are showing strong preferences that perhaps don't align with real world data?
So I guess kind of to give this question a bit of context, I kind of want to just briefly explain what strong preferences means in relation to our work. So Katrina's already kind of briefly explained it. But what we essentially did is we created a large data set of open-ended queries about companies, governments, and cultures that users kind of might realistically ask to AI assistants. And so what we essentially did is we created 20 topics related to these sectors and then created questions that consumers in different user groups might reasonably ask. So Katrina's already mentioned the running shoe example. So an example user group could be budget-conscious shoppers. And the idea here would be that each of the questions would then like prompt a set of recommendations which we could analyze. And what we actually found is quite interesting, as in a quarter of the topics, both ChatGPT and Gemini ranked their favorite entity. So just for interest, this was Nike in the running shoe case for ChatGPT and books for Gemini. But yeah, so they ranked this entity in the top 5 recommendations in over 90% of the questions. So this is kind of what we were talking about when we say there's strong preferences, as they have preferences that kind of persist regardless of how you ask the question or even the user group that's asking. So that was kind of a bit of a divergence, but I guess looping back around to the question, I think there's a number of ways that these preferences could be problematic. I guess one thing is research has like consistently shown that the order in which recommendations are ranked has a huge influence on what users eventually choose. So especially for smaller or more niche kind of brands, this could mean that like they're consistently ranked lower or never appear in the recommendations. And so it creates an invisible barrier for entry. Also, I guess kind of running shoes is like quite a low stakes topic. We actually found the same pattern extended to topics in government policy. So two of the examples were national healthcare systems and also educational institutions. So I guess for me, the main concern is that like as people increasingly use these kind of assistants as their main source of information, the preferences could kind of go beyond just issues relating to brand visibility, but even like distorting public perception of what constitutes like a good government policy.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's sometimes a slippery slope if we think about the initial experience most people will have with that, maybe on their Netflix or their Spotify, where it says, oh, you like this, we recommend this. But from what you're saying, particularly around kind of government policy, that's where this can become much, much more important. And I wonder, what was the most surprising misalignment that you found?
Well, yeah, I think the most surprising one for me, at least, was that both models said that the US had the best national healthcare system, which was a very surprising finding, I think, because I think that's not the commonly accepted narrative.
So the most surprising for me was actually the electric cars. When we ask what is the best brand of electric cars for like these different consumers groups, basically answer to all of it was Tesla. And BYD, which is one of the largest, if not the largest currently electric vehicle seller in the world, did not occur in the top 15. So there we could see how it is skewed.
Thank you both for that. And I think it leads into the next question quite well, which is, how do you think that geographic and cultural biases are developing in AI systems? So the examples that you've both given are kind of clear examples of that. And what impact do you think this might have on global users if they're being told that the US healthcare system is categorically the best and that Tesla is categorically the best electric car? What's the impact you think that might have?
Yes, so I will start with the first part of the question. So we believe there are three big areas that are contributing towards it. First is the composition of the training data. So if the models are trained mostly on data sources from the US, they will have very US-centric perception of the world. That we think is one big contributing factor. The other thing is that during the training, the system associate specific words or specific entities that frequently appear next to specific words or specific semantic representation. And then the model associates it with them. So, for instance, if Tesla is in the training data connected to something very positive, it will see it positively when it talks about it. This could be a problem for like a small or emerging brands that are not appearing in the training data at all, or that become popular afterwards. And the other thing is so-called user feedback amplification. It is when the AI system are used, the user behavior can reinforce the patterns or the biases by specific actions, such as clicking on a link that is provided to them. Then the system thinks like, okay, this user actually really likes this information, or the user actually thinks this is important information. And then it amplifies the bias. And so, as I already mentioned, like it is believed that the users believe the LLMs more than they believe their friends or other people. And I think Jasmine already mentioned that from the behavioral science, we know that people usually choose something that is recommended to them. And so the chance is that if you are recommended Tesla by a ChatGPT when you are looking for a car, you are much more likely to buy Tesla. And so if you don't do anything about it, it is likely that the users will be shifting to the brands and to the entities that the LLMs are preferring and favoring.
Which would then be reinforced, and then it would lead to more and more uptake because it would, yeah. Do you see it as primarily a training data issue? I know you mentioned training data, or is there something else that you think might be happening?
I do think it's primarily the training data and the way like the LLMs are trained on the data they are provided.
And how do you think someone in, say, China or India would experience these biases? Would it be different for them, or would it be that they're still seeing this more US-centric kind of data sets? Like, how do you see that impacting people in those areas as well?
So it a little bit depends, but I think the most important is the language you ask in. So it doesn't matter where you are sitting, as long as you are asking in English, I think you are going to get the same biased recommendations. The results are going to be likely very different if you ask in Mandarin or if you ask in Hindi or the local language, then you will likely get different results.
Which I think is a really interesting point, and it's one we've spoken about on the module with students before around this kind of challenge of language and the impact that it can have on your experience of using different AI tools and platforms. I wonder, Jasmine, a thought for you is, with that in mind, what concerns you most about AI assistance moving from seemingly simple information retrieval to now actively influencing user perceptions that can then almost be split further by language? There's some really interesting ramifications that are coming out of that if your entire experience is impacted by just the language you're using in the first place.
Yeah, I think there's definitely two very clear questions here. One is how the language is impacting it, and so all our questions were asked in English, and you've actually hit upon an area that we really want to look into more. Is if we ask similar questions in different languages, what's the impact? There's for example, in China, English is obviously a much less spoken language. If we're looking at it from a European perspective or an Australasian perspective, where English is still the dominant language, then we're still getting these hugely US-centric, or even Canada actually, these hugely US-centric kind of biases that are being kind of pushed on us, just because some of the smaller languages, like for example Swedish, obviously have a lot less training content, and so a lot of the English biases will be mixed in more. So I think it is partly a data bias, as you said, which is how much of the language they have to train on, and so how much they can rely entirely on that language. So how much, when they're applying in Swedish, they're relying on pure Swedish content versus kind of semantic understanding from English. But yeah, I think it's definitely an area that I think I would love to see more research in.
You touched on something that we've spoken about previously on the podcasts, and we speak to students about a lot, is not all cultures have a written language in the same way that we would have with, say, English or with Mandarin or Hindi, where it feels like there's a potential risk there that because some languages might be primarily oral, that they're not being collected. And so it doesn't necessarily mean that people will be asking questions in that language, but it almost means that they're missing, that you've almost got this kind of gap in training data. So ultimately everyone's kind of reverting to the mean, which might, in this case is English, because the majority of models will be much more likely to be anglophonic. And so therefore, if you're using them, as you say, in Australia, Canada, generally you'll be using more of these English language models, which means that everyone's almost being told the same thing, which can have benefits. But I can see from the discussion we've had and from reading your research, the real challenges that can come with that.
Yeah, and I think it really shows the importance of kind of each country not just leaving it up to the US companies to develop their model, but really taking it upon themselves. The EU AI Act is kind of being developed at the moment, and this will hopefully kind of spur countries on to taking initiative to not just leave it to these big companies, but make sure that their language is represented in the training data, their cultures are represented in the kind of data that's being fed to the models, and that the biases that we're identifying kind of are appropriate for them.
It leads us back to a consistent theme we have on this podcast, which is that the more we step into this AI-enabled world, the more we're having to question and understand ourselves. And so I love the point you made about different countries saying, okay, what are the inherent aspects that make us us? And how do we build that into a potential model that we can use without almost then doing the same thing again? So the obvious example is to say that, and I say this as an English person, that all we do is talk about the weather and cue. Now, you would probably build that in to a model, but that isn't necessarily, as a culture, how we would want to be defined. And so you then have this real challenge, I think, of the stereotypes being built in unintentionally, but then that can lead to further cultural entrenchment. I'm not sure if that's the right phrase or not, but where you end up leaning into yourselves and you become much more insular. Because if you're just using your, let's say, UK AI, for instance, it would ignore impacts from Europe and from America and other places like that traditionally I would think we get a lot of cultural impact from. I wonder, with that in mind, do you think that companies are aware that they're building these preferences into their systems, or is it an unintentional thing that's happening?
So I kind of want to start by saying I don't think this is a new problem. I kind of think that this is a problem that the recommendation community has been looking into for years. Even if kind of going back to my master's, looking at the bias in the hiring system, this was already kind of a problem that we were kind of trying to address. Of specifically, we're looking at gender between if you change your profile from male to female, how the recommendations you are getting changed. So I don't think this is kind of a new thing that we're addressing or a new problem that companies have to tackle. So I think they are aware of it. I think what's shifted is the subtleties behind it. So whereas previously in recommendation systems confined to a single domain, now that it's much more cross-domain. So for example, if I ask ChatGPT for like a restaurant recommendation, there's a good chance like the answers are being shaped by political biases in news articles used for training. And it's whether companies understand the more kind of complex interlinking of these biases. I'm not sure. But I think this isn't a new problem. I think they should definitely be aware that the data they're feeding in is having like impacting the bias. The way users are using the model obviously can lead to bias. Like I think this is a question that's been brought about for years.
I think that's a really interesting way of thinking about that issue of kind of bias, that it's not entirely new with these AI platforms, but actually just a continuation, and perhaps the awareness that your work and your research brings to it, I would hope would give people that kind of pause to reflect and think about when building these models in future. So thank you both. I think it's a really interesting set of perspectives that you've brought to this discussion. And I wonder if I could just ask the last question to both of you, which is, what steps do you think that we can take to ensure a positive future with AI, please?
So I think, first of all, as you already said, or as you asked before, like the awareness is crucial. So making sure that people are aware that the recommendations they are receiving and the answers they are receiving are not the single source of truth and are biased is important. I think it's also important for governments to be aware that this bias exists, because I know that the gender and racial and similar biases are well known in the recommendation systems. But this makes developing your own large language models or fine-tuning them or adjusting them to the market very important. So I would say the awareness is a big part of it. And from there, we can take the next steps, such as legislation changes, monitoring, and trying to remove as much bias from the training data as possible.
And I think you mentioned about the EU AI Act, Jasmine, as well. I think that's going to be a really important tool to hopefully try to do that. Jasmine, do you have any thoughts as well on this question of how do we ensure a positive future with AI?
Yeah, I obviously completely echo everything that Katarina said. I guess the only other thing that I would add there is that I think one of the first things that I would need to happen is just simply creating frameworks where we can easily identify the model, like the biases that might be present in these models. Because from my perspective, new releases seem to be happening all the time. Like it really feels like almost every week a new model is coming out. So just having kind of systems where we can easily identify potential bias would create a really good baseline. There's already a growing number of benchmarks measuring social bias. So that's bias against protected characteristics like race and gender. I think the hope with our work is to expand even beyond that and to verify that the kind of AI is aligning with what the users said they care about. For example, if someone asks for sustainable options or local businesses, the system should be responding with exactly that and not just defaulting to whatever's the most popular at the time or the most well-funded. So kind of our hope when we created this benchmark was that it would be a first step in that direction. But yeah, it would be great to see more research creating benchmarks that are more aligned to that goal as well.
Yeah, and I think your point about this alignment question is a really, really important one that hopefully listeners will go away and be able to look at more as well. Thank you both so much. It's been really, really interesting to speak to you. I'm really looking forward to having further conversations. Thank you so much and have a lovely rest of the day. Speak to you very soon. Thanks.
Oh, thank you so much for the conversation.
Yeah, it was great to chat. Thanks for having us on.
Bye-bye.